Renegade brings back wood. DBNI Field is good. And Conk takes on Hood. I'm David Hood of the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, February 2023. For our feature story, longtime San Diego-based diplomacy hobbyist Conrad Von Metzke recently passed away. He was the publisher of many diplomacy zines, served in various hobby leadership roles, and was a frequent and enthusiastic denizen of the hobby's letter columns for decades. Von Metzke was involved in diplomacy from the very beginning in the early 1960s, and only recently stepped away from hobby activities due to his health. Later in this program, we'll interview Doug Kent, the current editor of Diplomacy World, about his own interactions with Conrad Von Metzke and discuss Conrad's diplomacy legacy. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. Renegade Games has announced more details for its new version of Diplomacy to be released sometime this summer. Under an agreement with Hasbro, Renegade has edited the earlier rulebook for clarification, and leaving all the classic rules intact. They are bringing back wooden pieces, much to the delight of many longtime fans. These pieces will be shaped as either cannons or ships, in a similar vein to the earlier first edition Hasbro release, which had metal pieces. As part of their Renegade Con video stream on YouTube, the company also released the new cover art for their diplomacy set and announced support for the diplomacy events at Gen Con in Indianapolis. For a link to the video, see the link below. The diplomacy content can be found towards the end of that video. February fever is here. The field of 28 players for the 2023 Diplomacy Broadcast Network Invitational Virtual Tournament is now set, with preliminary rounds the weekend of February 17 through 19, and the top board scheduled for Saturday, February 25th. You can catch all this action right here on DBN, as every round will receive full coverage on our YouTube and Twitch channels. A link below is provided to our website, where you can find a list of participants, tournament structure and scoring details, and a press and play link to the episode of DBN's Countdown show in which those player selections were announced. Which players will make up the Super 7 who reach that top board for the chance to be crowned Diplomat of the Year as winner of the Calhammer Cup? Will 2020 season winner Peter McNamara or 2021 season winner Jason Massbaum have a chance? Will top seed Brandon Fogel add the DBNI crown to his Virtual Diplomacy League victory? I don't know, but it sure will be exciting to find out. Speaking of the VDL, Chicago player Brandon Fogel did indeed capture that league's championship with a devastatingly dominant performance on the VDL top board back in January. His Russia took control of the game from the beginning and cemented an early capitulation by the rest of the board with a deft stab of his Turkish ally in fall 1903. The rest of the board was unable to coalesce around any alternative to his topping the board, and they voted that result at the end of 1906. In the French language league, past World DipCon and Virtual Diplomacy Championship winner Nicolas Sahuguet of Quebec came out on top, playing Germany in a touch-and-go top board in which multiple players had their chances at the crown. You can watch these two very different games by using the links below to watch the DBN coverage, and Brandon's explanation of the VDL final from his perspective, as written in the Diplomacy Briefing newsletter, is also linked below. The London Diplomacy Club is back in face-to-face action, with a game day being held March the 4th at noon. The location will be in Covent Garden, which is part of London's West End. Marvin Freed, Conrad Woodring, and others welcome new players to their club through their Facebook presence. A link to this event can be found below. In other club news, last month I reported on the New York City-based club, the Diplo Rats, beginning its club play. I can report that its inaugural game was actually played at Grand Central Station. Richard Lowenberg topped this board as Austria. You can see some photos linked below. If you and your friends are playing diplomacy in a club setting, let us know here at DBN so we can publicize your efforts. Now let's take a trip around the world of YouTube channels and other diplomacy content creators to report to you on the latest and greatest new diplomacy products from what we call our DBN Media Partners. Marcus Zylstra just released a new video on his DiploStrats YouTube channel focusing on the top board from his BlitzCon tournament back in the fall. Yes, the one featuring Blitz diplomacy, i.e. 5-minute turns with full press negotiations on web diplomacy. And yes, this was the event won by a very suspicious player named Franz Brosif, who ended up being, well, a robot. You can watch Marcus, who's known as Captain Meme, and his fellow commentator Ezio call this game at the link below. Also, Malarkey has resurfaced on his website, the Diplomaticon, to feature an interesting article about the EF Alliance, which on DBN we call the Leviathan. He starts by quoting from Richard Sharp's famous book on diplomacy from the late 70s, and then adds his own thoughts on the Leviathan from both the French and English perspectives. Check out his Diplomaticon using the link provided below. The 2023 season of North American face-to-face action just kicked off the first weekend of February, with Riaz Virani capturing the Cascadia title on his home field of British Columbia. Fellow Vancouver area resident Chris Brand, who is a past world champion, ran this Cascadia event with his usual efficiency. Virani adds this face-to-face win to his recent World Championship victory at the 2022 Virtual Diplomacy Championship back in December. He interestingly sealed this win with a strong last-round performance, playing one of his favorite great powers, Turkey, just like he did for the VDC. David Miller of Maryland took second place with a dominating 15-center Russia in his last round game, and Washington State resident Dave Roberts came in third. A link to DBN's Cascadia coverage can be found below if you missed it live. Now think about this. Not only does Riaz Virani head into this month's DBNI as the third seed overall based on his performance during the 2022 season, he now almost certainly has a bid already to next year's DBNI in the bag. A flash in the pan, Riaz Virani is not. Now that the 2023 Cascadia is in the record books, the face-to-face tour in North America continues with events in Marlborough, Massachusetts, San Jose, California, and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. First up on February 23rd to 26th is TotalCon, run by Alex Maslow, located about 30 or so minutes outside of Boston. Then comes the San Francisco Bay Area tournament called Whipping, which was the site of last year's North American Diplomacy Championship. He's run once again by Adam Silverman. The dates are April 15 and 16. This year's 52nd annual DipCon, the North American Diplomacy Championship, will be held in conjunction with the longest-running tournament in the world, DixieCon, the last weekend of May. Of course, diplomacy tournament action is also planned elsewhere in the world for 2023, including this year's World DipCon to be held in Bangkok, Thailand, August 17th through 20th. There'll be another event in Cambodia called the Angkor Imperial the following weekend. Registration information for all of these events, except the last one, are available in the links below. We occasionally talk on Deadline about the zine era of diplomacy hobby history, in which fan-published magazines sent by mail constituted the primary way in which hobbyists interacted with each other. Zines not only ran games, but also included articles on both hobby and non-hobby subjects, letter columns for discussion of various topics, artwork, humor, basically all sorts of fanish things which contributed to the formation of community between diplomacy hobbyists. Doug Kent, whom you will see in an interview later in this program, has an online zine archive to allow folk to get a sense of how the hobby used to operate. He just updated the archive with more zines recently, so you can check it out using the link below. I'm also here to tell you that not all zines are dead. Several are still in publication, including a new one just started called God Save the Zine from old-time British hobbyist Stephen Agar. He just published his first issue. You can contact him to be added to his mailing list using his email, godsavethezine@gmail.com. All right. We have talked about tournament and club play already. So let's turn our attention to diplomacy league play. Both of the English language virtual leagues restart play in March for their 2023 seasons. The Virtual Diplomacy League, run by Zachary Moore, will begin play on March 11th, with rounds starting at various time zones so that folk from around the world can join live in the fun. Similarly, Gary Sturley's Tour of Britain will commence on Saturday, 18th of March at 4 p.m. UK time. Which of you has the ambition and skill to overthrow His Royal Highness Tim Crosby and seat yourself on the British throne? The tour's format will be basically the same as last year, 8 games with one's 4 best scores counting towards crowning that next British monarch. Below is an invite link to the VWCDC Discord server where both of these leagues are actually housed. It's now time for the interview segment of this month's deadline. Conrad Von Metzke's recent loss feels a lot like the death of Larry Peary back in 2019. A giant of the hobby is gone, and coincidentally, someone who was also based in San Diego. To discuss Conrad's role in the hobby in general, and Diplomacy World in particular, let's talk to longtime Diplomacy World editor and publisher and Texas resident, Doug Kent. Hello, Doug, and welcome back to Deadline.
Thank you, David.
Before we talk about Conrad, tell us a little about the history of Diplomacy World and your own history with the magazine.
Well, Diplomacy World was founded in 1974 by Walt Buchanan, and it was supposed to be a way to tie together all the different parts of the hobby, the postal hobby, face-to-face hobby, local clubs, talk about rules. It had actually, when Walt started it, it had basically everything that it still has. It had a demonstration game. It had variants. It was supposed to be just a catch-all for content relating to diplomacy that wasn't specifically actual game results. And he started that in 74. I came in as publisher for Jack McHugh, who was editing in 1993. And after a couple issues, he had to back out, and I took it over with issue 74 in 1995. I stayed with it for about 4 years. Then I dropped out of the hobby, and then it wasn't until 2007 that Jim Burgess, who was trying to get it going again, sort of forced me under threat of physical violence to come back and take it over again.
Funniest part about that story is thinking of Jim Burgess actually engaging in any physical violence because he was such a gentle soul.
But he's bigger than me.
He is much bigger than you. Yeah.
He was much bigger than me, so I had no choice. I had to do it.
Yeah, it's actually true. Well, you had the latest issue that was released back on January 2nd. What parts of that recent publication are you particularly proud of? Because maybe there's some folks watching this who haven't read it yet.
I shudder to think that they haven't read it. But that particular issue, which was number 160, the winter 2022 issue, I got very lucky, as I always seem to do, with some really great content. For whatever reason, it was a very variant-heavy issue. There was 2 new variants, one by Stephen Agar, and then there was Empire City by Paul Webb, which is based on the boroughs of New York City all going to war with each other. There was also a whole reintroduction to Ambition and Empire, and even an article from Bob Durf talking about types of variants he wanted to see, certain categories, certain historical periods, which is a great conversation to have because there's so many variants out there that people don't know about. Some are very good, some not so good, but are still fun to look at. So there was that stuff which I really enjoyed, and because I enjoy hobby history, I really enjoyed your article on Diplomacy World 40 years ago, and Stephen Agar's article on trying to return as a zine publisher to the hobby that he was once more active in.
Yeah, I also liked his piece a lot.
There's a lot of good stuff in there, though. I mean, there was the Chris Kelly's 2 pieces on Weasel Moot. So there's a lot of more recent event coverage, and I like the different types of event coverage you get between streams like this, between short little blurbs and then larger photograph included articles that we run.
What role do you think Diplomacy World plays in the hobby of today?
It's a changing role. It's a little difficult to define. We're still trying to bridge between the different factions of the hobby. It becomes more difficult, as you know, because the factions aren't closely aligned anymore. There's people who only play face-to-face. There's people who only play online and never use the real names. There's old-timers who remember, mailing orders in postally. There's people who only play regular diplomacy, only gunboat, don't care about variants, don't care about the personalities behind the game. They just want to play a game like playing a game of chess against someone. So we try to build content that can appeal to each faction, but not only to those factions. It's really just about bridge building between everything and trying to make things into a more cohesive hobby without necessarily having any kind of central organization or foundation to it.
Well, I personally think it does fulfill that role pretty well, and it's a role that needs to be fulfilled, which is a good segue into talking about Conrad Von Metzke, who also played a number of roles that needed to be filled in our diplomacy hobby. What do you think? Well, I know he interacted with you regularly in your role at Diplomacy. What do you think about him as a hobbyist from your perspective?
Well, Conrad, who, as most of your viewers may know, we recently lost after a long health issue. We did some not memorials, but tributes to him a few years ago when he first announced his failing health. This is a guy who, by the time I got into the hobby in the late 80s, he was already an old timer. And this is the guy who started the first attempt at a postal diplomacy game in 1962, who took over Diplomacy World. He was the second editor and publisher of Diplomacy World. He founded the first game orphan service to try to rehouse games that had been abandoned by their GMs and publishers. He must have published, I think, about 20 different zines during his time, including up to just a few months prior to his death. He was still doing some haphazard internet publishing. He was somebody who really took the service within the hobby seriously because he loved the hobby so much, even though as a diplomacy player, he'd be the first to admit that he was dearly lacking in positive results. He was kind of famous for his poor play, especially his poor play of Austria, which was his favorite nation to play, but I don't think he ever got past 1908 in a game.
It's kind of an old joke among the old time part of diplomacy hobby. The service people, the people that did a lot of organizing and really establishing the fabric of the hobby, sucked as players. Larry Peary, God rest his soul, really could not play very well. And Conrad, self-effacingly would say that about him, about his own play.
Which it shows how much the game is much more than just the tactical movement side, because those areas, both those players that you just mentioned, had no problem with. They were great at that and at building ideas of what to do, but it's the negotiation side, and probably for different reasons, that both Larry and Conrad had great failings on the diplomatic side.
Yeah. Well, one thing that he didn't fail at, Conrad, is that he served both as Miller number custodian and Boardman number custodian, which were really important jobs back in the day, but some hobbyists now would have no idea what we're talking about. So to talk about what the Boardman number custodian and the Miller number custodian did.
Sure. I think I've touched on this a few times in Diplomacy World, but I've never heard any response back, so I'm probably just speaking to myself. But the Boardman number custodian and Miller number custodian were registration services. When you started a new game of diplomacy, you would register that game with the Boardman number custodian and be given a registration number. This wasn't any type of hobby control. This was for two reasons. One was so that if you abandoned the game, there was a clearinghouse that had the information on how the game had started. So if the other players wanted to continue it, the Boardman number custodian for diplomacy and the Miller number custodian for variants had the information. But it was also so that people that wanted to examine how different games were doing, how different variants were performing, how different nations within regular diplomacy were performing, had a clearinghouse to go and see the results of all the games being played in all different areas, not just one zine, but every publication. The early part of the electronic hobby on CompuServe, America Online, and Prodigy were all compliant with the BNC and the MNC, submitting for registration numbers and submitting their endgame results and endgame reports, so that there would be a regular publication of all results of all variants, and it helped the diplomacy variant designers as well. They could go and look at the results and say, okay, my variant's been played by, here's 5 games of my variant I didn't even know were played. Here's how the results were. I see, China is winning all these games of one type of variant. Maybe I need to weaken China a little bit, because obviously with a variant game, it's a lot harder for players to know that certain powers are more powerful than others and to tailor their play appropriately.
Yeah, that's right. And the custodians would publish like a zine sometimes that have the results in them. We were joking before we went on air about the fact that Conrad did everything in the hobby, including publishing the zine called Everything.
Exactly. And Everything was the last, and officially it's still being published. Tom Howells, the current BNC and MNC, hasn't published one in a long time because he barely gets any submissions, but he still issues numbers. Conrad started publication of Everything, and then passed that on to Melinda Holly and whoever else took over after that. And that's still, I have many issues of it in my postal diplomacy zine archive. That still serves for some people as a great way to go back and look at how during different periods different nations performed. But yeah, I mean, Conrad did everything. And I've called in Diplomacy World a number of times before that I wish that the Boardman number custodian, Miller number custodian were still being done. I'd like to see a clearinghouse of that kind of information. And with, the online hobby so prevalent, it really wouldn't take that much work to build a front door to allow for automatic submission of game starts and game finishes for that kind of thing, if the hobby was interested in developing that. But I think that it seems that people just aren't really interested in seeing the overall picture. They're more focused on the individual games.
Well, within the websites they play, there is a similar function in the sense that there is a game name for those games. I mean, you'll see that like on PlayDip.
Absolutely. And absolutely. But of course, that's a very insular look. When you have a group of players that prefer a particular website or a particular any group, their plays can be tailored amongst each other. I mean, you go back to the studies that people did about postal games that were played in the United States versus postal games that were played in the United Kingdom, and how much differently England as a nation was played in those two groups.
Yep.
When you don't have crossover between players as widespread as you might like, the results are very strikingly different.
Oh, yeah.
Just like now, Turkey is the nation nobody wants to play. It's a nation that gets eliminated all the time. But, 30 years ago, Turkey was considered one of the 2 strongest nations on the board.
And actually, this came up in an episode of Deadline last month because one of the guys that was on the segment was from Play Diplomacy and talking about how strong Turkey was. And we're like, not in the virtual world, they stink. So it still goes on even today.
Although I guess it's really about, of course, we're really painting Turkey wrong. It's not that it's more powerful or weaker. It's how the other nations initially treat it as a power. When Austria and Russia get together immediately and say, we got to take out Turkey, well, then, yes, if Turkey is treated as a threat immediately, it's going to suffer. And I guess in some areas, it's still not. It's still treated as a regular power and often flourishes.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a function of people playing with different other people, as you just mentioned. Groupthink is a thing. Well, we talked about Diplomacy World and the fact that Conrad was the second editor of it. I think maybe 1978 or so is when he took over. He also published some other zines, which I know you subscribed to. What was he like as a zine editor and publisher?
Well, his schedule was a little lax at times, but there was really nobody within the hobby who loved to write and to discuss and debate more than Conrad. So his zines were very heavy on letters, on just short columns of whatever he was thinking about, and they grew thicker and thicker as his energy would grow, and then a little bit thinner as he'd become more distracted. But the games, while they were always there, I mean, in later years, he spent more time doing, choo-choo games. I'm not saying that disparagingly, and not so much diplomacy, but it's still even there. It was more about him having fun, and fun was the other thing. He was all about enjoying himself and laughing. I mean, this is a guy who, created in the postal era a fake of a Belgian zine, just to have fun and enjoy watching people get confused about that it was fake. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, in 1962, he started the first diplomacy game postally ever, but it's not officially the first game because it never got past that organization stage. It never had a spring 1901 move. But years later, just to rub some people the wrong way and laugh at them and see them get uptight, he created an entire fictional history of that game and argued that it was the first game and that it had been played to completion, and therefore it was the first diplomacy game, not a game by John Boardman in 1963 in Graustark. And he just did that not because he wanted to be more important. He did it because he knew that people were going to take it too seriously, and he could laugh at them.
Including Boardman himself, who did not have quite the same sense of humor.
No, John
that Conrad has.
John, who I believe is still with us,
yes,
has always been very straight-laced and very insular. So he was not happy. He took great offense to someone trying to besmirch his historical importance.
I believe the correct word for John Boardman might be persnickety on this point.
Yeah, the picture of John is probably there in the dictionary next to persnickety.
What do you think Conrad Von Metzke's legacy will be in the annals of diplomacy?
Well, I hope that it's twofold. I would hope that his true legacy, when viewed by others, will be, number one, the tremendous amount of service that he did to the hobby, all the posts that he took, all the orphaned and dropped, abandoned games that he took over and completed just so the players could have a completion to a game that they had put a year or 2 years into. His work on Diplomacy World, his work on with everything and the Boardman number custodian. And I hope it's also the fact that the thing he loved about the hobby wasn't specifically the game of diplomacy. It was all the people playing it. All the people he got to know that he treated as close friends just because they played the same game that he did. People that he met once or never, that when he heard they were coming to California, to San Diego, he was like, oh, come on over to my house, have dinner, hang around for a few hours, even though they wouldn't even talk about diplomacy. He was always there for anyone that came by or that was in the area. And if he just saw your name somewhere, that was enough for him to say, okay, this is somebody that I connect with and that I can enjoy time with. And I think that above all is the part of the hobby that I hope he'll be most remembered for, and the part of the hobby that I hope continues to grow and flourish is that it's more than just playing the game. Like I said, it's not just facing an opponent on a chessboard and knowing what that person's rating is. The longevity for people within the hobby has to do with the other personalities in the hobby and the friends that you make and the other personalities, even if they're not necessarily friends. Everybody is a distinct individual with things to offer to other players. And I think sometimes it gets lost when you have games that, online games that last a week, face-to-face games that last 3 hours, and then people go their separate ways. There was a lot more investment in a game when it took 2 or 3 years to finish. I'm not saying it's better when it was 2 or 3 years, but that aspect of the game, learning about the other players you played with, is something that I still try to do, although sometimes it gets strange looks.
Yeah, it's not everybody understands that aspect of our hobby, but you and I certainly do, because we met in the 1980s in this hobby and are still interacting today. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done with Diplomacy World and otherwise, other zines you've published, the zine archive, which, by the way, will be mentioned earlier in this episode of Deadline. And I also wanted to thank you for being on the show and talking about our mutual friend, Conrad Von Metzke.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I miss Conrad already. He was a special guy.
He was. And now for our feature presentation. Saturday Night Live had its point counterpoint. ESPN has its pardon the interruption. So it's time the Diplomacy Broadcast Network had its own segment of contention and controversy. So this month we debut it. It's called Two-Way Draw, in which diplomacy topics of the day are debated in spirited fashion by yours truly against prominent denizen of online play Jordan Connors, who's known more broadly online under the name Conk. Hello, Jordan, and welcome back to Deadline and for our new segment, Two-Way Draw.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here. Great to see you, though you look dark and tiny on my.
Yeah, that's pretty much on purpose.
Okay.
I feel like it goes with my theme for me to be a little dark and for you to be a little bit on the red side. I just think that goes with our theme.
I do look a little red. That's all right.
Yeah,
I'm ready.
All right. Well, as you know, we're going to take some debate topics here and have some fun debating them back and forth. I don't know if we need to set any ground rules. What do you think?
Well, I would propose for the purpose of this segment that we just work together. We collaborate. We don't take any shots at each other. We declare a 17-17 two-way draw, as it were.
Wow, it's not really what I was expecting you to offer, but okay, fine. We can do that.
Terrific. Face-to-face niche folks are so gullible. Let's go.
Oh, here we go. All right. Well, our first topic is for England, 1901 is all about Belgium. What do you say about that, Jordan Connors?
Obviously not true. That's false. For England, 1901 is all about the builds of your neighbors. Give up Belgium, give up that channel, give it all up. If everybody's building armies, they're all pointed away from you, and you're going to have a nice, long, and profitable game.
Could not be more wrong about that. 1901 really is about Belgium for England, because unless you get some presence on the continent so that you can have diplomatic flexibility, things to offer to people and things to have people offer to you, then you are not going to be part of the game. So I think getting that fifth center for England, just like getting that fifth center for Turkey, it's all about that. And Jordan, I'm sorry, but you're wrong about that.
Ridiculous. You're embarrassing yourself.
Well, we'll see what you think, what the audience thinks about that. The best diplomacy players play online. I'm going to take this topic first and say that is clearly not right, unless what you mean by best diplomacy players play online, it's like playing video NFL on a video game system versus playing actual NFL on the field. If you're saying that the video guys are better, then yes, best diplomacy players are online. Otherwise, the answer is niet, as they say in Russia. What do you say, Jordan Connors?
David, it's not at all shocking that you would take that view. I don't know that you can turn on a computer, but the answer is clearly yes. Best players play online. It's just a matter of logistics. It's hard to get 7 players in a room. If you just go to face-to-face tournaments, you're going to be meeting the same players and probably a small group of them. If you go online, you can play instantly against a variety of opponents in bigger tournaments with better competition. There's no question. Best players play online where they can find more opponents and better tournaments.
So you're saying that the easier it is, the better off you are. That is quite a way to think. I guess it's just a difference in generation. I think hardship builds character and builds strength. So if you take the easy way out, then yes, the best diplomacy players play online. Let's look at the flip side of this. Face-to-face is the ultimate test of diplomacy skill. Jordan, I'll give you a chance to agree with this one first.
The answer is no. And I understand there is this tiny niche within diplomacy of traveling face-to-face players who have promoted themselves as world champions, etc., when in fact, they are only the champions of the 15 or 20 people who could afford a plane ticket and had that weekend off. You can get a lot more tournaments with more people and better competition playing online. That's the bottom line. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, David, but that's the truth.
Well, I think, as usual, you're missing the point of the question, which is the ultimate test of diplomacy skill. Is it really diplomatic skill to sit around for hours and days or longer to think about things, or have a contest that actually tests your ability to think on your feet in the moment? And since the latter is clearly the ultimate test of diplomacy skill, that requires you to be at a face-to-face game board.
If I can interject, David has, of course, espoused the opinion of a decade ago when online play was all extended deadlines, 1, 2, 3 day periods, when in fact, we've got blitz games, we've got speedboat, we've got 5-minute press games, so that if you want to go quickly, you can do it online and you can find a lot of players from all over the world ready to do it right now.
Yeah, no disrespect to Marcus Zylstra, but the 5-minute deadline thing is fine, but I'm not sure that's the ultimate test of diplomacy skill either. But let's go on to the next subject, which is, when I say let's get to a 17-17 draw, I mean it. Now, Jordan, do you mean it when you say let's get to a 17-17 draw?
Now, the 17-17 draw has been, belittled. It's been mocked, but it's a true, real thing. If you have strong players who know how to protect themselves on both sides of the line, I couldn't be more serious. You can slowly work your way there. And it is a real goal and something to shoot for. And it's not to be belittled. It's not to be mocked. David?
Let me belittle and mock the past several seconds of airspace in the diplomacy airspace community. It may not be completely unheard of due to a 17-17 draw, but when people say it, they don't really mean it. You may settle for it. You may end up at a 17-17 draw. But what you really mean when you say that is, let's do a 17-17 draw where my 17 is 18 and your 17 is 16. That's actually what it really means. Tell me I'm wrong, because I'm not wrong.
Obviously everyone's trying to maximize, right? But any discussion of an alliance has to have a goal. And 17-17 is a real thing you can work towards if you got smart players on both sides. Now, if you have someone like David, who is a little more careful and cautious and doesn't have the confidence to move their pieces up to the stalemate line and create a natural stalemate, then you're right. 17-17 is impossible.
You are right that people will believe that I am not bold and lack confidence. People think I don't know what I'm doing, but they don't think I lack confidence. Let's move on to strategy tactics articles are usually wrong. I have to defend against this one and say no, because I having written a bunch of strategy and tactics articles since about 1986 or so, I have to think that sometimes we know what we're talking about. In fact, most of the time we know what we're talking about. I think it's good homework for people to do, to go back and read articles, either the old ones or the newer ones, and get some insights from other players. Why could that possibly not be a good idea?
Again, ridiculous for Mr. Hood. If you are right now sitting down to read a strategy or tactics article from David Hood or anyone else, put it down, pick up some Shakespeare, watch The Sopranos, God forbid, go outside, get some life experience. My best messages in diplomacy of all time have nothing to do with the game and have to do with life experience. And that's what you should focus on. And that's how you can improve your game. Bottom line, nobody cares what the latest, French opening is called. Learn how to deal with people. That's what the game's about.
Alas, poor Jordan, I knew thee well until you stepped into that trap and said a bunch of stuff that doesn't make sense. You can read the strategy and tactics articles. You can decide whether or not you take some of it at face value or not, but it's certainly worthwhile to do. And it can't be right that they're usually wrong. Gosh, that seems like a strong statement.
Such a waste of time. Go live a little and talk about that.
Speaking of living a little, draw size scoring is a fine scoring system, Jordan Connors. What do you say?
That's definitely false. I'd say the main advantage of a draw size scoring system is tradition. It's the same way for swimming with dolphins in tiny swimming pools or bullfights in Spain. There's a lot of tradition, but if you really think about it, it doesn't make any sense. Draw size scoring, you get to the mid game and there's no way to differentiate between different size powers in the draw. It creates horrible incentives to whittle the tiny David Hoods on the board. It doesn't make sense as a way to move the game forward and reward good play. It's simply a matter of clutching your old, tired, dark hands to tradition.
You know what I'm clutching? I'm clutching the rule book, which says that you either win with 18 centers or you draw. I'm not sure why the rules of diplomacy are something that diplomacy people like to fight about and say are terrible in their favorite game. It's the freaking rules. Draw size scoring, of course, can differentiate between the player. It is true that there are plenty of examples where they don't do that, but you can differentiate based on supply center total. It's a perfectly fine way of looking at the game.
Just as we all expected, David had nothing to say for the system except to go back to decades-old dusty tech that no longer has any relevance today.
I wonder when Renegade releases its new set of diplomacy this summer, I wonder if it's still going to say in the rules that you win with 18 centers, and if you don't, there's a draw. I suspect it might still say that in the newest edition of diplomacy.
Based only on tradition and not common sense.
All right. Well, let's go to solos or failed boards. Jordan, what do you think about solos or failed boards?
Absolutely not. Solo is an exquisite work of art. I think it's fashionable for those who were left out of the solo to try to blame others, call them irrational, and call the board broken or failed. But the truth is that players who lose to a solo are but shades of acrylic paint on this beautiful masterpiece that's been created in front of them.
Literally throwing shade, Jordan Connors is here on Deadline with that language. I would argue that often solos are failed boards. It's people that have lost sight of their goal, which is controlling the stalemate line to make sure nobody crosses it in force to take over 18 centers. That actually is a purpose of the game, is to prevent a solo from happening. There are some exceptions to this, but often solos are failed boards because someone has failed in their job and let someone else get an advantage when they shouldn't have.
Yet again, we hear from Mr. Hood the kind of comment one would expect to come from someone who has lost to a lot of solos.
Well, it is true that back in my day, people actually went for solos more often. So that you might actually be right about that last comment. All right. It's your own fault you got stabbed. I'm going to have to say no to this one.
Oh.
And the reason I say that is because I enjoy doing a good stab. And I don't think it's just because they played poorly. It's because I played well. So it's not your own fault you got stabbed. You might have had something to do with it, but it's mostly the skill of the stabber, not the fault of the stabbee. Jordan, why am I wrong here?
You're wrong, David, because at least from the perspective of the person who got stabbed, there is this really easy instinct to start blaming the person who just took your dots, to start blaming the failed board around you when it absolutely is entirely your fault, and you should take accountability, figure out what you did wrong. Somehow, some way, the person who stabbed you thought that they could gain an advantage by taking your dots, and that's on you. Next time, if you don't take responsibility for it, it's going to just keep happening again, David.
Well, it is not true that the stabbee is a passive receptacle, but I do think that you have to put pressure. I mean, you have to put emphasis and credit on the stabber for making a good move. What's wrong with that? I guess if you had ever come up with a good stab, Jordan, you would be thinking the way I'm thinking here, as opposed to not doing that.
No, I'm not going to argue. That's a whole different prompt, Mr. Hood, and I think you changed the rules on the discussion, but that's fine. Absolutely, the person who made the stab is right on the money, made a great move. I mean, they might have blown it, but if you get stabbed, it's on you to make sure it doesn't happen again. It's on you to set up a board where your ally or your neighbor has something better to do than come after you.
All right. Well, let's go to one that I'm going to give you a chance to get in your licks here. Those who cannot play become diplomacy commentators. Go ahead, Jordan. Go ahead. Do your worst.
I appreciate the opportunity to stab you here on the broadcast, though I'm going to decline. I have to say, anybody willing to spend time in that dark hole that you're in right now, talking about diplomacy, trying to get other people to play and explain how it's done, and to have guests like me on, I can say nothing other than all the other things I've said negative. I can't say anything negative about the decision to spend your time this way. So thank you.
Wow. All right. I don't know how to respond to that except by taking the contrary position, which I will do. It is true that sometimes people who are diplomacy commentators apparently cannot play. The last tournament that I won was in 2001, which was 21 and a half years ago. So there is at least empirical evidence that this statement is correct as it applies to me. On the other hand, Brandon Fogel, who's one of my cohorts at DBN, is the top seed going into the DBN Invitational. And Riaz Varani, who's also a face-to-face player, just won Cascadia yesterday, is one of our diplomacy commentators. So there clearly are some people who can play, apparently just not me.
Good. let's not take time insulting anybody willing to get up here and spread the good word.
Fair. The sharpest knife is called I'm sorry. Jordan, what do you
That's
say about
absolutely.
that?
Yeah. Right on the money. That's true. That's a yes. By sharpest knife, I think that means sort of the best tool. It's so easy in a game of diplomacy to be hard-headed and stubborn and want to be right and want to explain why you're right, when being humble, showing remorse when you make a mistake, or even showing empathy when maybe you made a good move, but it totally wrecks somebody else's game. Acknowledging it, saying you're sorry, acknowledging the monster that you are, I think goes a long way towards the next step that comes after a mistake or a stab. You're going to take the other position, David?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind when I hear about this is that I want to say, in response to what you just said, Jordan, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that that's the way you think about this game. I'm sorry that that's the best you could come up with as an answer to this question. I am sorry that you apparently don't understand that the sharpest knife is something that you use over and over again. You're not going to be able to use that over and over again if you're always apologetic about it. I always, if I'm using my knife to stab somebody, I always explain how the board position made me do it. That's not really I'm sorry. That's an explanation of why they should have seen it coming.
Thank you for apologizing to me, David Hood. I feel better about you now and more willing to listen to the next thing you have to say.
Well, actually, the next thing I have to say is also our last topic for this segment, which is backstabber is way better than play diplomacy or web diplomacy. Jordan, what do you say about that? I want to go ahead and get you to start some kind of civil war among the online community, so go.
No, that's false. That's wrong. Backstabber has pretty pictures, but it doesn't have a community. It's all about the people, David. It's all about the forum community, the rivalries, the friendships. Backstabber doesn't have any of that. And until it does, it cannot hold a candle to web dip or play dip. Bottom line.
Actually, I surprisingly agree with some of what you just said there, that the community really is the most important thing. Backstabber is a nice looking interface, and it looks good on DBN when we used to use it on DBN. It looks good on the screen. It looks better than the other two on the screen. But I agree with you, actually, that the community building is an important function that both WebDip and PlayDip provide. The only thing that's bad about WebDip and PlayDip in particular is that they've provided somebody named Conk as always at the top of some leaderboard, which is sort of aggravating after a while.
Well, I think we agree on most of that answer. I think you're a little misguided and jealous and sad on the last part, but it's nice to have some agreement anyway. So
well, when you can't play like me, then it is easy for me to cast stones at those who are apparently playing and doing well. Conk, I really wanted to say thank you for being on this segment of Deadline, and good luck to you in the future. And based on your answers, you're going to need it.
Thank you, David. Delighted to be on your program. And as always, you are a dark, cold, tiny man.
I agree. Thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly using davidhood@dixiecon.com. For our other broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.